Hi there everyone. In today's video, we're going to learn how to conduct a basic social impact measurement for a business case. You see, there's a growing consciousness that business activities can have a negative or a positive impact on society and the environment. Pressing and complex global challenges like global warming, the plastic soup, questionable labor practices in developing countries, these have led to people asking more questions. And as we increasingly scrutinize the behavior of citizens, businesses, and governments, there's been more emphasis on understanding what the actual impact and implications are of the activities that we engage in. According to this report by Deloitte, millennials believe that after governments, businesses are some of the main entities that could help solve some of the societal and environmental challenges that our globe faces. Slowly but surely, we're demanding that businesses redesign themselves and that they pay more attention to the positive and negative social implications of their actions. And we do see changes in companies. Cases like Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, and Lush are just a few better known companies that are actually trying to measure their footprint and trying to improve their social impact. One way that they're able to achieve this is by measuring their actions and activities and reporting on these. Impact measurement is a strategy that more and more businesses are adopting when they want to achieve sustainability. To do this, they use an impact measurement tool. Impact measurement tools are applied methods of measurement that allow businesses to measure their social, environmental, or economic impact. Impact measurement is often done through both desk and field research, and it helps companies to understand their current impact, benchmark their impact, and perhaps set new targets for the impact that they want to achieve in the future. Now, a deep dive into impact measurement highlights a few things. One, the impact measurement sector is growing, and as a result of that, there's more and more tools for measuring your impact. This report highlights 25 different tools that impact investors can use to measure the social or environmental impact of certain business cases. Two, impact measurement is complex. This short paper presents 20 different impact tools and suggests that each tool may be suitable for a different business case. Similarly, this paper highlights a range of different tools and actually categorizes them according to their ability to either measure social impact, environmental impact, or economic prosperity. This goes to show how context-specific impact measurement can be. While we have developed standards for commercial performance development, think of your standard financial statements like a profit and loss statement, a balance sheet, creating a sales forecast, calculating break-even. These are globally and universally accepted concepts and forms of measurement. This is, however, much tougher to do in the case of social impact. Think about it. A restaurant, for example, that hires ex-convicts in its kitchen is going to have a very different form of social impact from, for example, a chocolate manufacturer that tries to reduce slavery or remove slavery in its supply chain. And to compare these two is near impossible. This leads me to point 3, investment through impact measurement. Now, although it's difficult to compare one social impact to another, we have seen that investors or philanthropic investors, in other words, investors that want to do some sort of good, actually like to be able to compare to some degree the social impact of their investments. This has led to some interesting developments. One in particular is the fact that in some of the financial capitals across our world, we now see social stock exchanges popping up. These are investment platforms that allow individuals that want to have a social impact in their investments to find good cases for their investments. And finally, the fourth point. This increase in impact measurement has also led to the increase in certification bodies. Certification bodies like B Corp, Fairtrade, the Rainforest Alliance, Global Organic Textile Standard, and the Carbon Trust Standard are just a small sample of the amount of companies that are offering a form of external certification to help companies understand their social or environmental impact. This has helped to create transparency and certain standards in industries and to change practice. In this video, we're going to zoom in on impact measurement by looking at how business cases can actually measure their impact and set long-term impact goals for their actions. This will provide you with an introduction to the concept of impact measurement, and we will use a basic tool known as the theory of change to conduct a simple impact assessment. But to understand impact measurement, it's good to first be conscious of why a company might engage in this activity. A quick literature review highlights 6 key reasons why a company might actually measure its impact. Number 1, they care. In this case, a company actually wants to understand its external mechanics and wants to understand how it can improve its business activities to have more social impact. Number 2, the mission of the company is primarily a social one. In some cases, a business actually exists to have a social impact. Good examples of these are social enterprises. If you are a business that wants to have a social impact and actually prioritizes social impact over commercial well-being, then it would be in your interest to be able to measure your impact, right? Number 3, investors might demand it. As we touched on this earlier, there is such a thing as philanthropic investors. Philanthropic investors are individuals that actually want to have a positive social impact through their investments. Now, if you're a company engaging with such a philanthropic investor, they're probably going to want to see what the impact has been of their overall investment. And similar to this is number 4, subsidies or grants. Nowadays, there's a lot of subsidies and grants available for businesses to improve their business activities or change their business activities to have a social impact. Now, in order to prove that you have achieved that social impact, businesses will have to conduct some sort of impact assessment and report back to the government or the foundation or the nonprofit organization that has given them that grant or subsidy. Number 5, there's a growing pressure from consumers and from governments on businesses to conduct themselves in a certain manner. This has led to sometimes legislation being put in place or consumer pressure on businesses to start looking at their social impact and improving it. And finally, number 6, marketing. As consumer trends dictate the way companies market themselves, and as we see that consumers are becoming more socially and environmentally conscious, this has led to an increase in companies measuring their impact and reporting on their impact to improve acquisition. This can, of course, lead to the concept of greenwashing occurring, where companies try to market their activities as being extremely social or environmentally conscious when they might not actually be. And as such, in the ideal situation, a company never only measures its impact for marketing purposes, but actually wants to achieve a positive social or environmental impact for different reasons, and the marketing is a necessary and a good spillover of that effect. So in the ideal situation, a company actually measures its impact because it wants to do some sort of social good, and it prioritizes a social mission. A good example of such a company is CorrectBook.
Hey, my name is Sam. Every day I walk into my office with the idea I could really make an impact in life. 3 years ago I was in South Africa just on holiday and I discovered the big lack of school materials. If you have nothing to write on, how do you ever know how to write and read? I think every single person should have the possibility to write endlessly. So I started CorrectBook. CorrectBook produces endless writing materials for everyone. Our main product is this reusable notebook. CorrectBook sells their products to you, and by doing that we give them back to children in Africa. We started collaborating with the biggest companies in education and in the business world to start spreading our story, our products and our belief. CorrectBook helped over thousands of children in need learning how to write. It looks so beautiful, but for us it's just a start. We got a new, almost unbelievable mission. CorrectBook wants to provide 1 million reusable notebooks to children in need in the upcoming 5 years. Are you curious if we are going to succeed? Join our battle.
CorrectBook is a social enterprise, which means that it prioritizes its social mission and changes its business activities to suit this mission. CorrectBook was established to help battle the challenge of child illiteracy in developing countries. It does this by offering a product, the CorrectBook. The CorrectBook is essentially a reusable notebook that CorrectBook sells in developed countries to consumers that have a higher income, and it uses some of the surplus of its profits to provide a Correct Book to a child in need in a developing country for 1 trimester. Correct Book partners with local NGOs in these developing countries to disseminate the books and to create collaboration with local schools. So Correct Book is a good example of a company that has a social mission. But the question is it effective in achieving its mission? And can it measure its social mission and its long-term impact? We'll find out more about this in a little while. While there are many tools for measuring impact, a good starting point is to conduct a simple impact assessment using the theory of change model. The theory of change model is a tool that is often used by nonprofit organizations to understand how the intervention that they've had as a project actually leads to a certain change, hence the name, theory of change. A theory of change aims to highlight the steps and activities taken that lead to a certain change occurring. A theory of change can be conducted in 2 ways. Either you can start with the intended impact you want to achieve in the long term and then work backwards to see what business activities you need to establish to be able to achieve that long-term impact. This approach is particularly suitable for companies that really emphasize their social mission, or for companies that haven't yet established their business activities but want to achieve a certain social goal. The other way of conducting a theory of change is by starting with the business activities. In this case, you will look first at what the business activities of the business case are, see what kind of effect they have on a certain consumer group or stakeholder group, and then measure the long-term effects of that intervention that you have on that stakeholder group. This approach is particularly suited for companies that are already engaged in business and that want to see how their existing business activities actually impact a certain societal challenge. In either of these 2 approaches, the basics of the theory of change process remain the same. The job of those conducting a theory of change is to understand the various actions that are necessary to accomplish a certain impact. Once these activities are clear, they can be measured, and the company can consciously decide if it wants to change certain activities to either reduce negative impact or improve positive impact. A theory of change, also abbreviated to TOC, is a linear measurement model that aims to document the short and long-term impact that a business has through its business activities. The TOC is modeled around the impact value chain developed by Clark and Rosenzweig in 2004. As the purpose of today's exercise is to get a taste for impact measurement, we will conduct a simple theory of change that will introduce you to the main 6 building blocks. These building blocks are inputs, outputs, outcomes, short-term impact, long-term impact, indicators, and assumption. By collecting data for each of these building blocks and understanding their interaction, we will be able to develop a good theory of change. So let's look at each building block one by one. Firstly, we have inputs. Inputs are the resources and activities that the business commits to bringing about an intended output, outcome, and impact. These inputs will lead to what is known as an intervention, a change that you hope will take place as a result of a respective input. Inputs can be listed as resources such as money, time, staff, expertise, and perhaps more importantly, as activities. Activities can be listed as the interactions and engagements with the stakeholders, such as offering a product, purchasing a product or service, marketing, advocacy, and creating partnerships. They can also be projects that a business case engages in, like community outreach programs, new acquisition strategies, or an innovation project. Let's look at the example of Correct Book. Now, this example is based on a simple desk review into the case of Correct Book. To complete a thorough TOC, however, I would need to have a close interaction with the team of Correct Book and its stakeholders. For the purpose of this exercise, I will focus on one input from Correct Book, the product. Remember, however, that there could be a lot of other inputs as well, other activities, whether they're advocacy and awareness activities that Correct Book engages in, or other product lines. So, For the resources of CorrectBook, I have written some generic resources like marketing, their network, the books themselves, consultants that they hire to engage with local schools, and the local NGOs that they partner with to make their sales and to connect with schools. For the activities, I've listed selling CorrectBooks because that's the product that they're offering to their market. Now let's move on to outputs. Outputs are the actions, products, and services that were delivered to a customer, a beneficiary, or a stakeholder. Just as a side note, a beneficiary is a person or a group of people that a social enterprise or that a business is trying to have a positive social impact on. This can be different from the customer, which we will see in the case of CorrectBook in a second. Outputs are usually described numerically and can therefore be quantified. For example, here you would state how many customers you serve per unit of sales, or how many people are reached through a marketing campaign or an outreach program. Outputs are therefore measurable and will give a good starting point for measuring the reach of your potential impact. However, while many companies will stop there and use outputs as a tool to profile and market their business activities, outputs does not provide a clear picture of the actual impact of a given input. So you see that so far we've created a relationship between the inputs of your actions and the outputs that this creates. This transaction connects the business case with a stakeholder. Sometimes this transaction is referred to as the intervention. In other words, you are offering an intervention by providing an input to a stakeholder. Depending on the nature of this intervention, your outputs, outcomes, and impact may change. And that's how you can control your theory of change. Let's look at the case of CorrectBook again. So what I've done here is I've listed two forms of outputs to differentiate between the output that's given to a consumer and the output that's given to a child in a developing country. So basically, for every one input of a CorrectBook, you'll have one customer who buys the CorrectBook, but you'll also indirectly, or as a result of that purchase, you'll have one child who gets access to a CorrectBook in a developing country. Now let's look at outcomes. Outcomes are direct and meaningful changes for the population served, such as anticipated changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, behavior, conditions, or status. An outcome is therefore a direct and implicit effect of the fact that you have created an intervention. An outcome is a change that occurs because of the output. It is measurable and time limited, although it may take a while to determine its full effect. In the case of CorrectBook, we can look at the outcomes for the consumer, which I've highlighted in a teal color, and the outcomes for the children who get the book, which are highlighted in yellow. Now, it's useful to use this kind of color coding in a theory of change to show different pathways of impact. In the case of the consumer, some of the hypothesized outcomes might be that there's more awareness created about child illiteracy. And another more functional outcome might be that consumers use less paper because CorrectBooks can be reused. For the level of the children who get the CorrectBook, children will have paper to write on for 3 months because they're given a CorrectBook for 1 trimester for every SIL. And a child may be better able to complete schoolwork as a result of having a CorrectBook. So these are very tangible and direct effects of the fact that the child has this book. Now we will move on to impact. Impact consists of the shorter and longer term results that are directly due to the outcomes of the program. Now, to get this right, the results must be evaluated to factor out other explanations for these results. In other words, is it really your intervention that caused this impact, or were there other reasons external to your actions that may have caused the impact? Now, impact is often hard to measure since they may or may not happen, and often lie outside of the scope of your direct business activities. They are what one hopes to accomplish in the future. For this reason, impact is often harder to measure and more abstract than, for example, an outcome. To further dissect the impact of a specific outcome, it can be useful to differentiate between short-term and long-term impact. The lengths of these are contextual and should be based on the judgment of those conducting the theory of change. What's interesting to note is that impact, especially long-term impact, could affect more than just the stakeholders who were part of the intervention. For example, what are the long-term effects on the larger population or on a neighborhood as a result of your intervention? Let's have another look at CorrectBook. Firstly, the short-term impact for CorrectBook. The short-term impact for CorrectBook can again be split according to consumers and the children. For the consumers, a direct and short-term impact of the outcomes might be that more awareness in friends' circles of child illiteracy is created, and that potentially those individuals, those friends of the consumers, will buy more CorrectBooks. Another short-term impact may be that there's less waste of office materials like paper because consumers start to use their CorrectBook at work. These, remember, are hypothetical short-term impacts and need to be tested and verified. For the children, one form of short-term impact may be improved atmosphere in class as a result of the fact that children are better able to complete their schoolwork. Another form of short-term impact may be the quality of homework, that it improves, and also that children feel more confident in the short term. Now let's look at the long-term impact. Long-term impact can again be dissected according to the level of the consumer and the child. For the consumer, we might see that more and more people start to contribute to child literacy in different ways above and beyond the purchase of CorrectBooks. Another thing we might see is that we have cleaner offices and that there is reduced environmental degradation in the supply chains of office materials. For the children, the fact that they're able to use a CorrectBook may, in a long term, lead to more empowered teachers as they feel like the grades of students are increasing, which also leads to the next form of impact, the fact that overall there's an improvement of grades and that there's better school rankings in that developing country. And finally, we'll see that overall the learning achievements of the child improves and that they graduate on time. These are longer term impacts. Next, we have indicators. Indicators are specific, observable, and measurable characteristics, actions, or conditions that show whether or not a step in a theory of change has been achieved and to what degree. Indicators can be useful and helpful to track progress over time and to see if the intervention actually has the desired results you anticipated. The use of indicators highlights the fact that businesses that engage in impact measurement should do so continuously. This is not an activity you do once. It is a constant and living thing that demands regular measurement points, learning, and adaptation to your theory of change to improve it. Let's have a look at CorrectBook. What I've done here is I've listed a number of indicators in red next to different outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And I'll go through some examples. So for example, one of the indicators could be a target that you set for the number of customers at the output level that actually buy the CorrectBook. You could say that only if X number of customers buy the book can CorrectBook be a success for social impact. Another example of an indicator can be found at the children level at outcome, where we could actually measure and see if the CorrectBook is being used and if children are using it over other materials. And as we move along the theory of change, we see that we can conduct a variety of assessments to assess, for example, whether there's less waste produced as a result of the use of CorrectBook, to see if more and more customers are becoming aware of child literacy, and to set certain measurements in place to see if educational quality is increasing over time. And finally, in the theory of change, we have assumptions. Now, in a theory of change, each step is dependent on specific conditions and behaviors. If these conditions are not met, it could affect your overall theory of change. Therefore, it is good to reflect on the expectations of these conditions along each step of the theory of change. We call these assumptions. And once we have identified certain assumptions, we can then test to see if they are valid or not. In the case of CorrectBook, I have placed a star in certain places where we could highlight some assumptions. Now, normally I would write out these assumptions and then check for their validity. For example, one assumption is that for every purchased CorrectBook in a developed country, a child in need is actually receiving that CorrectBook. This may seem obvious to you, but if that interaction isn't actually happening, if something is going wrong there, then the whole theory of change will fall apart. Another very interesting assumption that I would definitely want to test is at the level of outcome for the children. I've put a star next to child has paper to write on for 3 months because I would really want to ask myself the assumption, do children not already have something to write on? Because if the children already have something to write on, then essentially the CorrectBook is an unnecessary product, and hence its impact is questionable. So that's something that would really need to be checked. Another interesting assumption that we can look at is how consumers use the CorrectBook. Do they actually use it in the place of normal paper? If they don't, that might affect how much less waste they produce. And finally, another assumption that we could test is at the level of impact to see if the use of a CorrectBook actually does improve the overall quality of education and the quality of homework. If that is not met, then again, the impact won't be achieved. So that was the theory of change. I hope you found that exercise useful in understanding how this model works and how you can use it to conduct a basic impact assessment. I'm going to highlight a few tips when using the theory of change that you should keep in mind. Firstly, it's best to conduct a theory of change on a business case that you actually have access to, in order to really understand the various business activities and know what you should be looking out for in terms of output and outcome and long-term impact for that matter. It's important that you have access to content from the business case so that you can speak to the team and look at how they actually conduct their business. Secondly, ideally, a theory of change is conducted together with a range of stakeholders. Often, a theory of change will be conducted through a focus group with various stakeholders from different groups. This allows you as the consultant, let's say, or the person doing the analysis for the impact assessment to ask very direct questions about a certain output, a certain outcome, or a certain long or short-term impact. Thirdly, interventions come in various shapes and sizes and are not always the obvious thing. Sometimes the most impactful action of the business is not the product or the service, but actually the awareness campaigns it has or the interaction it has with its ecosystem. Because of this, a theory of change is often a complex exercise, and it demands time to reflect, time to think, and time to really understand the various linkages in the whole theory of change. Another tip is to become more aware of your own confirmation bias. When you are trying to map a theory of change, we have the tendency to try to shape the theory to suit a certain form of impact that we hope is achieved through the intervention. However, we have to be real. Always take a step back and make sure that you're not shaping the outcomes or the impact to suit a certain narrative. This leads to another tip, which is to consider both the intended and the unintended impact of the intervention of the business case. Often when speaking to the team from a business case, they will say, this is the impact that we hope to achieve, and hence your theory of change will focus on those forms of impact. But what about the unintended impact of their business activities? Have you mapped those? Are there some things you haven't thought about that are also creating impact because of a certain intervention? And finally, remember that using the indicators, you can actually help a business case set new targets for itself. So to conclude, I think it's fair to say that this exercise highlights how complex social impact can be, and especially the exercise of measuring social impact. There are many more layers to impact analysis than we might realize. And without measurement, we can never really be sure if a product or service that we bring to a market to have a certain intervention will actually have the impact that we intended it to have. Through measuring, perhaps we'll be able to tweak the product or tweak the way that we deliver it to a stakeholder or a beneficiary or a customer, and by doing so actually improve our overall impact in the long term. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is optimize the intervention so as to increase the overall social impact we can achieve through that intervention. This idea of optimizing impact is closely connected to the concept of effective altruism. As beautifully simplified by Peter Singer, effective altruism is where the desires of our heart are connected and coupled with the rationale and the evidence-based logic of our brain to overall improve our ability to have a higher impact. And this is where a tool like the theory of change or another impact measurement tool can come in handy. So, I hope that this video has provided you with enough information to start your own basic impact measurement using a theory of change. I hope that using the example we presented of CorrectBook, that you understand how complex and how multifaceted impact measurement really is, but also how rewarding it can be and how helpful it can be in ensuring that your business activities have a positive social impact. If you have any questions about social impact measurement or strategies to create successful social startups, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to help. See you in the next video.